Hello everybody, we might get going now. My name's Michael Duffy and I'm a member of the BAD board and I've written a few crime novels. I'd like to welcome you here today and to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, the City of Sydney, the State Library and Create New South Wales, without whom we couldn't be here. This is a session about three women who were in their own ways brave but also significant because they did a huge amount to alert the people of New South Wales to the reality of organised crime and corruption. And I'm not sure if many of you can remember, looking at your ages, I'm sure some of you can't, but it's extraordinary how long it took before the people of New South Wales became aware of just how corrupt the police and some of our politicians were. I was just saying to one of my fellow panellists that the Sydney Morning Herald apparently didn't use the phrase organised crime until I think it was the early 80s or something, you know. Even the expressions that we use now to describe these phenomena weren't there back then. So it'll be interesting to talk about that, talk about the women in the context of that gradual revelation, that increase in understanding. I'd also just like to thank everyone who's watching us from Zoom. A lot of the libraries around New South Wales have been really good, and I know there are groups of people in libraries and some people coming in via their libraries, and that's fantastic. If you'd like to ask any questions as we go, please just send them in using the chat function. We'll allow about 20 minutes for questions at the end anyway. I'll just introduce the panellists. Duncan McNab is an ex-detective, a journalist and a true crime author. Most recently he's done a book about COVID and the Ruby Princess, but he's also the author of biographies of Abe Saffron and Roger Rogerson, which will come in handy today, I suspect. John Dale is a retired academic and author of crime novels and the biography of Sallie-Anne Huckstepp, who of course is one of our subjects today. He's also the editor of Sydney Noir, a recent collection of crime short stories. Can I just ask, is anyone here, if you wish to disclose it, a relative of any of the people we'll be talking about today? Because we want to approach the conversation, you know, with complete respect, of course. And I'm just wondering if anyone has any sensitivities or anything they'd like to raise. No? Okay. Not that we're going to, you know, we don't plan to say anything that anyone would dislike, but we just want to be respectful. Okay, well, I think we might get going. We're going to be talking a lot about these three women mentioned in the program, but I thought we might start by acknowledging an earlier figure who's not that familiar, and her name was Shirley Briffman. She was also a whistleblower in the early 70s, and she was a prostitute. She was one of Sydney's leading madams. She actually came from Queensland originally, and she ended up, well, she had police protection for quite a period, but she ended up, for some reason in 1971, putting a 13-year-old daughter to work in one of her brothels. And even amongst Sydney corrupt police, this was considered excessive behaviour. And so she lost her support and she was actually charged, and she ended up retreating to Queensland. But on the way, she gave a big interview to This Day Tonight, and she started talking about some of the honest police in Sydney. And she died of an overdose in Brisbane in 1972. Duncan McNab, maybe start with you. Was Shirley Briffman a sort of John the Baptist figure for the people we're going to be talking about today?
She may have been the starting point, I think, for a lot of this. I suspect that Shirley, with all due respect to her, might have also had some self-interest in mind and a bit of payback. And the copper that was thought to have possibly assisted in her overdose, and this is still contentious. I think as recently as earlier this year, her daughter is still advocating that her mother was murdered, presumably by a New South Wales police officer called Fred Cray, who will pop up occasionally in this discussion, by the way. Fred was big, unattractive, brute of a man, but also reputed to be quite a killer. And he was the main point of conflict with Shirley from memory, and it's always been suggested that her overdose wasn't an accident and that Fred had been up giving her a hand. He departed the New South Wales Police Force when things got a bit hot for him, I think, after that interview. And policing in those days, you weren't sacked, you were just suggested that you might actually depart quietly, and everything was smoothed over. So I think Shirley was the first person to stand up, and it's a curiosity about this time too, and up until the very, very early 80s when some of the others became more involved, is that if you wanted to blow the whistle, it was really hard to find someone to blow the whistle to. The ABC This Day Tonight was one of the few choices you had. If you went to some of the commercial newspapers, in those days you had plenty of choices, the Herald, the Telegraph, the tabloids like the Mirror and the Sun, which used to pop out regularly. It wasn't uncommon for the crime writers who you presumably go to blow the whistle to be on the terps at a pub with the detectives from the CIB that you would probably be complaining about. So the chances of getting your story up were tricky, and the dangers of actually talking to some of these old reporters was also reasonably high. Some of you will remember Gerald Stone, the 60 Minutes, who brought 60 Minutes to Australia. Gerald once quipped, and I think I borrowed it a couple of times, that tried to tell the truth that and he was working with an old cop reporter called Bill Jenkins from memory. He actually wrote a story that told the truth about some police skullduggery and was cornered by Bill Jenkins and told that his career would be ending if he tried that stunt again. And then they'd all go back to a small pub in Surrey Hills, which is called the Royal Standard. It's still there. It's a pub just behind Commonwealth Street, and that's where the journalists drank, and that's where the coppers would drink. So it was a very close arrangement. So blowing the whistle was pretty damned hard and a bloody dangerous thing. And it wasn't until some years later that Shirley's work, possibly as a catalyst, to make people start thinking that other people, and we're going to be talking about them shortly, built on what Shirley had started. Whether she did it from self-interest or whether she was genuine about it, I don't know, but it was a bloody great start.
John, have you got any thoughts on Shirley Briffman, but also the wider subject that Duncan's alluded to of just how pervasive and quiet the corruption was in Sydney?
Yeah, I think she was the first one before Sallie Huckstepp to really talk about police corruption. I mean, she named 50 police officers from New South Wales and Queensland who were corrupt, and it was after that she fled to Queensland. She was put in a safe
Sorry,
house.
you just have to hold on.
Oh, sorry, it's not her, can't hear. And she fled to a police safe house in Brisbane, Clayfield, I think was the suburb, and it was there that she took an overdose while her her daughter believed she was murdered. And her husband was sure she was murdered, and he made sure that when she died, she wasn't cremated. She was buried so that they're hoping to get an inquest into how she died. But the person they thought went to her house, gave her a bottle of whiskey and stuffed pills down her throat, was, as Duncan has mentioned, a detective called Fred Froggy Cray, who, they're all interlinked. The more you know about this crime period, the more they all pop up, these names, and Fred Froggy Cray pops up later with Juanita Nielsen. He left the police force straight after Shirley Briffman went on TDT, or This Day Tonight, and he died in 1981, and all I remember about that was 200 police and criminals went to celebrate his life at his funeral.
It's one of the honest police that Shirley Briffman was speaking to just before she died was called Brian Doyle, who was a New South Wales policeman, and he was known apparently by some of the corrupt cops as the Cardinal. And Ray Kelly, who was probably the leading corrupt cop up until 1966, used to get trainees to be detectives. And one of the questions he'd ask them is, would you be prepared to fit up a criminal in order to get a conviction? And if the trainee said no, he'd tell them to go back to the Cardinal because you're no use to us. And of course, one of the confusing factors back then, and tell me if I'm wrong, Duncan, is that honest or so-called honest cops sometimes used frame-ups as well as dishonest cops because they just lacked many of the techniques that we have today, like listening devices and mobile phones and even a lot of forensics. It was actually quite hard sometimes to obtain a conviction by honest means, wasn't it?
Yeah, this is very good, and this is how the likes of Roger Rogerson particularly, who was round doing his mentors were people like Fred Cray and these other characters. you often hear it called noble cause corruption, which I think is a pretty nice way of trying to get away from the fact that you've done something horribly illegal. But cops used to take the... We'll get her.
They're building a bar on the roof.
This isn't a coincidence, by the way.
I think Roger's listening in. Back in those days, it was not uncommon for, if the coppers had decided that someone was guilty, and they in many cases they would assist the prosecution by, there's a couple of stories that you're told when you're a young detective, knock on the door, Crim opens the door, detective hands him something and says, "Happy birthday." The Crim says, "It's not my birthday." Copper says, "Yes, it is." And there's a bag of drugs. Or on occasions, "Congratulations, here, have this gun." "I don't want a gun." "You'd have it now, you're under arrest for possessing a firearm." Or, as Roger was a master of, later on you get them back to the police station and you'd be interviewing them for the crime that they'd committed, typing the record of interview, but they wouldn't be in the room. And then at the very end you say, and the person declined to sign his record of interview. The poor bugger might have been in a separate part of the police station. He had no idea what he was being fitted up for. And a lot of the magistrates, and I remember when I was a kid, a mate of mine's father was a magistrate, and he said to me when we were just gossiping about it, he said, "Oh mate, I don't mind that the police fit people up so long as I've got the right bloke." And they assured me they have. Where the bent coppers found this very profitable is that they then used it as a tool. So if they didn't like you, they would remove you from play by loading you up with a crime. Or if they wanted to punish you because you hadn't been sharing, for example, they'd also load you up with a crime. So it wasn't unusual for them to pull this stunt and then stand in court and swear blue that everything was legitimate. And again, one of the greatest witnesses in a criminal trial you could ever have was Roger Rogerson, who was a natural actor. And he would stand up there and swear convincingly that what he had done, the weapon he'd found, the drugs he'd found, or whatever it happens to be, was utterly legitimate. There wasn't a thing wrong, and everyone would nod. And he'd get down to the witness box and completely have lied to them completely. He would have fitted them up with everything. And that's how these guys work. So the line got really blurry between coppers trying to do the right thing and then other coppers thinking, well, this is a good enough idea. We've established a precedent. Let's use it to our advantage. And this is particularly handy if you're incredibly crooked, as so many detectives of the period were. Corruption was endemic. And as Michael said, forensics, well, you possibly get a bloodstain and think, oh, a typo, or a fingerprint. And that was about as far as forensics went. It was rudimentary stuff back in those days. And quite often crime scenes were somewhat disturbed by the coppers that had arrived. I think last year we were talking about, I went to, just a curiosity, went to a bloke's lying down on the ground, he's dead. We're called up because the young coppers are a bit suspicious. They're sitting around the dead body having a hamburger, a Coke and a smoke, thinking, well, this is not how you really do it. Different times.
Thanks for sharing that, Duncan. Let's move on a bit. We'll come to Sallie-Anne Huckstepp shortly because she has some similarities with Shirley Briffman. She was a prostitute who also got on the wrong side of the police and started to talk. But let's just talk about Juanita Nielsen first, a very different sort of person. Some of you may have seen the coverage on the ABC recently. John, can you just remind us? I mean, who was she and how did she come to trouble?
She was the heiress to the Mark IV fortune, and she was the person that stopped the development in Victoria Street. She was a real character. I've been reading up on her recently, and the bit I liked was that whenever she went out, she had to spend half an hour in the morning putting on her false eyelashes, and she wouldn't go out without her wig on. So that big beehive was a wig on top of her hair. She was very particular about her style. She was a very stylish woman for that period, the 60s and 70s. Now what happened to her, there's a lot of contention about that. I don't know if any of you saw the ABC documentary, which has been criticised heavily since then because they came up with a witness who said he had information from the jail, but which wasn't true. He didn't say that at the inquest. But anyway, she went to the Carousel club in the Cross around 10:30 on the 4th of July 1975, and she was never seen again. Now that's where the interest lies. Who killed her? She was trying to stop development from Frank Thiemann, who was who was in debt because he wanted his developments to go ahead. I mean, everyone knows those details, I think, about Juanita Nielsen, because she's passed into sort of myth about taking on those developers like Frank Thiemann. Some people say Abe Saffron had something to do with it. It probably boils down, I don't know what you two think, but between two people who were responsible for her death. And I'll leave it there just to tantalise you, because we're going to come back.
Duncan, would you like to come in on this? First of all, do you think Nielsen even knew her life was in danger? Was she just a bit of an innocent blundering into this? And secondly, any thoughts on what did happen?
Yes to both. The Juanita, I've done quite a bit of digging around. I've been fascinated since I was a kid at university, going up there in 1975 to watch all this taking place. It was great theatre. And that's before she disappeared. And Victoria Street has always been compelling because my family have lived up around there for years as well before they skated out to the suburbs to hide. Juanita was not terribly radical at all. She went up there in about 1968 after she'd had a bit of a dispute with her father that had been resolved. She decided to start a newspaper called Now, and if any of you have got some time, Now magazine has been beautifully preserved intact downstairs in the State Library. So you can go and pull the old copies out and have a look at them, and it's a nice capsule of the time. The King's Cross, when she was up there first arrived, was this extraordinary place. Was full of strip clubs, the Australians' rock music scene, the best place in Sydney to go to eat. It was full of sex workers. The Americans on leave from Vietnam had just started arriving, so it was the very beginning of the heroin problem. And all of these remarkable people and remarkable stories are crammed into pretty much 1 square kilometre. And the place is pumping 24 hours a day. Enter Juanita. She starts a magazine called Now, and she makes her revenue by selling advertising. And she'd write the copy. She'd also turn up, if you were in women's fashion, she'd turn up and do the modelling for you as well. And I think her partner, David Farrell, would also take the photographs. So it was a complete one-stop shop. And she was reasonably low-key. In around about 73, 74, I think it was, a developer called Paul Strasser, who was one of the Askin Knights, those of us old enough to remember, if you were a particularly shifty knight and a property developer, chances of getting knighthood from Robert Askin was pretty high. Strasser decides to put a walkway over Victoria Street, which no one can quite work out why the hell you need a walkway to cross about, an ordinary suburban street. Juanita gets interested and starts digging. The green bands and the Frank Thiemann development, part of which is still hanging on the side of the cross, are going full cry as well. Juanita at that point wasn't terribly pro-development. She wasn't terribly interested in the squatters who were protesting either. She sort of cut her own path. The catalyst for her becoming an advocate was a young Aboriginal woman called Esther Blaskows, or George, it's sort of a bit variable, died one night in an arson, or a believed arson in a building on Victoria Street. I presume that it was either an accidental fire, or even though there was no power in the building, or it had been deliberately lit to try and scare the squatters out, and Esther died that night. And Juanita really reacted virulently and exactly on mark. She wrote a scathing editorial saying if this had been a woman from Pymble or Bexley, I think it was, she would be the victim. She was in King's Cross and no one cared. And that was pretty much the starting point for Juanita's advocacy, and she realised that the locals had a story to tell, and she used her newspaper to tell it. And she became a thorn in Thiemann's side. That said, I don't think she ever knew the danger she was in. She thought that the world wasn't quite as bent as it was, and she had no idea that she'd really put a foot into a pool of piranhas. As to who done it, I'm always the favourite. I'm a great fan of James McCartney Anderson, who was Abe's cross manager in those days. I'm stimulated by that because, one, I knew Jim, and he was a violent man who could kill and had killed. And in May 1975, Frank Thiemann gave Jim a cheque for $25,000, ostensibly, as they later said, to help Jimmy buy Frank's son a restaurant. Frank's son, as I recall, had no idea he was about to be the recipient of a restaurant, and Frank was a bit embarrassed that they actually had a paper chase of cheques to Jimmy Anderson. 5 weeks later, there's two people from the Carousel Club try to kidnap her at the door. She doesn't open the door, her partner does, so they think, oh, plan B. Plan B, up at the Carousel Club, literally 4 or 5 days later, and that's the last we saw of Juanita. her departure, I think, was, and it's a theme throughout all this talk, I think, is that she was troublesome. She had to be removed to try and let corrupt people thrive. And it's a similar story with Lynne Woodward and with Sallie-Anne very much. These were thorns in the side of very bad people. And in those days, the fastest way to get rid of the thorn was to remove them. And that's what happened to Juanita, I think.
And Frank Tiemann had borrowed a huge amount of money, hadn't he, to buy these properties, and the interest repayments were sending him broke. Like there was a sense of real urgency.
Yeah, he was hemorrhaging money. His grand plan to pull all of Victoria Street down and turn it into apartments was going up in smoke really, really fast.
And some of Juanita's possessions were found, I think, by the Great Western Highway out near Penrith, weren't they?
Yeah.
Any thoughts on whether that was a decoy or actually happened? It sounds a bit implausible, doesn't it?
Yeah, I've been a fan of the decoy routine. Someone just thought, we'll throw the coppers off, and this is not a bad way to do it. But, and it's one of the great enduring curiosities I have for the Juanita Nielsen story is that every couple of months someone will come forward with yet another story about where to find her. And it's the great Sydney mystery is, where's Juanita?
It'll probably never be solved either.
No, John, I agree.
You mentioned James McCartney Anderson. He gave evidence with the National Crime Authority. And recently I found the transcripts of his evidence, which fills 2 boxes. And he believed that Fred Cray, the detective who we think killed Shirley Briffman, was the killer. And not only he said that, but it was Mr. Big of the Cross in those days, Lenny McPherson, who was a heavy in the Cross, he also said that Fred Cray was responsible. So, I mean, there's a lot of, with James Anderson, he denied killing her, but 2 of his minions, one was the VIP manager of the Carousel, Eddie Trigg, he pleaded guilty to abduction, and his partner Shane Martin Simmons also, and they served 2 years. But they both denied being involved. They said she came to the club and she left. But there was a witness, a local real estate guy, who said he saw her at 11 o'clock getting into a yellow Ford Falcon, and James Anderson drove a yellow Ford Falcon. So you think of it's one person, then you go back to the other.
The curiosity about you, I've been reading this sort of, you and I have similar reading, by the way. All the stories years later, and being around at the time helps, you read the stories years later and you think, the source for all these different people seems to come back to Jimmy. And he was a very big mouth, young Jimmy, but I think one inquest he was dubbed the Iago of the Cross.
Yeah.
And there's that other lovely expression, Neville Rand said you wouldn't convict a dog on the evidence of Jimmy Anderson. He was a beautiful liar, very theatrical. If you dig around on YouTube, there's a bit of video I just love which sums him up beautifully. He's turned up in the Cross in a Rolls Royce. He steps out of the back of the Rolls Royce. This is for television, by the way. Can we interview you, Mr. Anderson? Sure, let me set it up. Gets out of the back of the Rolls Royce and he's got a shotgun in his hand. And you think, you couldn't get away with this anymore.
And then later he fell out with his boss, didn't he, Abe? Very badly.
Yes, the problem he had with Abe is Abe found out, and it was a strange meeting, Abe found out that Jimmy had decided that as Abe wasn't going to depart quietly from the top job, that Jimmy would have him shot. So he inveigled a hitman, offered him $50,000 and ownership of the Venus Room, which was an interesting establishment, the Cross to put it mildly, in return for the bloke whacking Abe. The guy was so concerned about it, he went to a friend in the coppers, and they both went out to Abe and said, I've been asked to kill you, and he was a bit upset about that. And not long after, all of Jimmy suddenly found every nightclub he was managing in the Cross he was no longer allowed into, and that the large Kiwi bouncers had been replaced by very large Serbian bouncers. It was a bloodless coup.
We might move on. We could talk about this forever, obviously, but we might move on to Sallie-Anne Huckstepp. And her fame begins with the fact that she was the girlfriend of Warren Lanfranchi, whom some of you would be aware was shot dead by Detective Roger Rogerson in Dangar Place in Chippendale one afternoon in June 1981. John's written the biography of Sallie-Anne, as I said earlier. Could you introduce us to her, please, up to that point in her life? What sort of person was she?
Well, she's a complex person. She went to, she came from the eastern suburbs, Dover Heights, North Bondi. She was probably at core upper middle class. She went to Maria College. She had an unfortunate incident happen to her when she was 14, 15. She had sex with a young man about a bit older than her, and she had to go to court, and she was eventually put on probation, which wouldn't happen today, because underage sex with an underage person, it's not a crime. Anyway, she was put into Minda Remand Centre, and after that her life went downhill. She became an addict. Her husband got her into heroin. She went to Dr. Bailey's famous or infamous Chelmsford Centre, where she had terrible treatment there. And she became a prostitute in Kalgoorlie, a prostitute in Darlinghurst Road. She had a daughter, but things, really bad period in her life. And then she met this guy who was just come out of jail, who was very fit. She thought he was very good looking, handsome. He weaned her off heroin for the first time in many years. And he was a crim, of course, and he was working as a heroin dealer, and that was Warren Lanfranchi. So there's a story leading up to how he was shot, and the police were after him and her, and they kept moving houses. I was living in Camperdown, just near where Lanfranchi was living at that time, and I remember when he was shot, there were 100 police cars all around the area. Lanfranchi's father, I won't go any further at this stage because I know Duncan's got a lot from Rogerson's point of view, but Lanfranchi's father spent the rest of his life trying to get justice for Warren Lanfranchi, because both Sallie-Anne and he believed that Rogerson had murdered him in cold blood, and I don't think there's much doubt about that at all.
Duncan, can you just tell us what happened in Dangar Place, to the extent that you can say, and are there any legal restrictions still on what we can say?
I think we still need to be careful, yes, about legal issues, but certainly it just focuses on Rogerson. Described, I think, aptly by an old mate of mine from the Sunday Telegraph called Warren Owens as high noon, which is pretty much what it was. My belief, and I don't think I'm too far off the mark, is that Rogerson and Neddy Smith, who just recently departed, were running a very profitable heroin trafficking business, Roger providing the insight, I suppose, and the cover for it. The two were also involved in armed robberies, Rogerson sort of making sure that Neddy didn't get into too much strife. And this is covered in Blue Murder, the original TV series, not the second one, the first one, quite competently, I think. A little bit of colour here and there, but that's all right. Warren Lanfranchi had done two really dumb things. He'd been getting product from the Smith-Rogerson franchise and standing on it, watering it down. And so their clients were complaining. And heroin trafficking, one of the bizarre things about it is reputation does matter, as in all forms of retail. If you're not very happy with a person, then you give them a bad review on Yelp. These guys were getting some bad crits. People were looking at Neddy Smith particularly, saying, the stuff you're selling us is crap. That was one problem, and Rogerson didn't like the blow or potential loss to their funding and reputation. The other slight problem, and this is a catalyst for Warren Lanfranchi's departure, is Warren was also still doing armed robberies without getting a tick-off from anybody, Neddy or the cops. And I think it was out around Drummoyne from memory one afternoon. Friday afternoons particularly were really busy. Armed robberies were very fashionable back in those days because everyone would go to the bank with a week's takings and get there before 5 o'clock. So the banks were awash with cash Friday afternoon. So it hit the bank between 3 and 5. They were heading off to a bank, I think it was in Drummoyne or Gladesville somewhere, and a young cop, they were just about to do the robbery, a young copper on a motorbike smells a rat. So he wheels them over. And young motorcycle coppers often had a bit too much bravado, so they, rather than waiting till reinforcements arrive, they'd just drive straight up to the bank and walk through the front door and say, "Here I am," which, as a detective, you think you're out of your mind. Wait till everyone comes. You need cavalry for this sort of thing. He spotted two dodgy-looking blokes in a car. He's wheeled the car over. Warren Lanfranchi is in the back seat. He pulls out a gun and, if my memory serves, tries to shoot the copper. The gun misfires. And the two blokes got away. In the view of the New South Wales Police Force, that is utterly unforgivable. And it was also gave Rogerson the opportunity to mark Land Franchi's cards very heavily. So he was pretty much signed his own death warrant. Later that in June, Smith is used as the intermediary by Rogerson to get Land Franchi to Dangar Place in Chippendale. They meet on Saturday afternoon. The armed hold-up squad, there's a sort of inner cordon and there's an outer cordon so no one gets in the way. And it keeps the public safe as well. Rogerson meets Land Franchi. Nettie Smith is looking very apprehensive because he knows that things are a bit astray. Rogerson's story is that Land Franchi tried to pull a gun out and shoot him, so Roger shot him twice. Everyone that I've spoken to takes Sallie-Anne's story that I think it was a cute story that Warren's pants were so tight he couldn't have put a gun down them. And Roger has done, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where police would assist by giving you a gun if you didn't happen to have one. So the story I've heard, and I think it's quite convincing, is that whilst Land Franchi was obviously a crook, he was just shot in cold blood by Rogerson, who was upset that his business had been stuffed up, and then they drop a gun on the body.
There's a tradition of that, isn't there, in New South Wales Police? Like if you've got some crook who's working with you and they go off the rails, you have to get rid of them, like John Stuart Regan, Philip Weston.
Yeah. And one of the cute stories, and can never ever be proven, is that Rogers dropped a gun on him. You always go with a spare. I think from memory, I remember years ago at the CIB when I was a kid, they were going off to arrest the Ananda Marga or something or other, God, so long ago. And the police cars are literally being loaded up with exhibits, guns, knives, all this sort of stuff. And then they rattle out the door to go and arrest these people. And if they don't happen to have a weapon, we've got one for you. Poor old Warren's lying on the ground. They had dropped a gun on him, and one of the great black humour that police have is that the gun was actually, they later found out it was traceable, so they had to swap guns.
And it was a Harrison Richardson revolver that had a misfiring pin.
That's
and
right.
Warren's father was a gunsmith, and he always said, why would my son take a gun that misfired to a meeting with an armed hold-up detective? So he was definitely murdered. There's no doubt in the world that he was murdered.
I'll leave that with you, John. How did Sallie-Anne react publicly? She said that when she heard the news of the death, Warren had actually left his gun at home and she went and dumped it in Sydney Harbour. But in terms of publicly and starting to talk about what had happened, can you take us through to the Land Franchi inquest maybe?
Well, I think this is what gets back to, we mentioned Shirley Briffman earlier, that up till that point, I think most people who were a prostitute or an ex-prostitute and a drug addict would have just shut up, wouldn't have done anything. But she rang the father of Land Franchi that day and at 6 o'clock, and he told her that his son had been killed. And he said, would you go to the media? And she said, yes, I will. And he said, if you do, you'll be killed. And of course she was. So she rang up Richard Neville, if you remember him. Not the librarian, but the rock star, well, what wasn't a rock star, but he was a writer, journalist, used to be on the Channel 9 show. She rang up him and told him what had happened. He took her up to the Blue Mountains, and he was working on Channel 9, I think, and he got in contact with Wendy Bacon, and they brought her on to 60 Minutes, and she went live. I don't know if you saw the clip at the time, but there was a lot more that she said. She named Rogerson, she named Smith, she went into all this detail, but they couldn't run it. So they gave a sort of much shorter version of it because of the legal issues. And apparently they were arguing with the lawyers at Channel 9 for hours that night about what she'd said. So explosive. I remember seeing it on television, I guess you two did too. It was really explosive. And then she didn't just shut up then, she kept going, and she walked into the internal affairs with her father, Jack Cribbershow, and she gave a really detailed account of the 32 policemen, or 32 times she'd paid off police over her career as a prostitute. She said the armed hold-up squad organised armed hold-ups, the drug squad organised drug deals, and the things that she said were amazing. Even if you heard them today, they're amazing. But back then, it was such a brave thing to do. So I think she's, and I'm not the only one, at her committal into Nettie Smith's trial, the prosecutor said she was the most important police whistleblower in Australian police history, and I think that's true. It was almost reckless what she did. It wasn't just brave, it was beyond brave.
Yeah, I remember interviewing Rogerson once, and he said he was quite bitter about her because he thought the media had given her exposure because she was good looking, and he thought that was just terribly unfair to him. There you go.
That's very Roger.
But he had a point in a way, because she was articulate and attractive. If she hadn't been those things, would she have had as much impact?
Absolutely right, absolutely right. You can see why he was upset, yeah. Yeah. And how did we go at the inquest, please? And this brings us to Lynne Woodward, who was sort of a friend. I don't know how close a friend she was with Sallie-Anne. Maybe you could tell us. But she was also called to the inquest, wasn't she?
Yeah, I didn't know much about Lynne Woodward, and I'd read all the Huckstepp files. But her boyfriend was a guy called Stephen Pawley, who did armed robberies with Warren Lanfranchi. She was also a heroin addict, but she didn't come into... There's hardly anything known about her, but apparently at the Lanfranchi inquest, she came out and said certain things about Rogerson, that he was involved in armed hold-ups, sold drugs, all this sort of thing. She was supposed to come back the next day to the inquest, and she was never seen again. So I don't know if do you know much about her?
Duncan, over to you, Lynne Woodward.
Yeah, she's an intriguing character. I think her partner at the time, Stephen Pawley, was in the car the afternoon that Warren Lanfranchi tried to shoot a copper.
Yeah.
So that sort of started things. And just a complete segue to, I understand that he turned his life around after all that, and is still living out in the western suburbs of Sydney, working, completely blameless ever since. One of the true success stories we find. It'd be nice to hear for a change. But she was, I think, pretty much there to corroborate Sallie-Anne's story, which is incredibly brave. And again, a heroin addict. She's got a young child. When Stephen was arrested, I think in around Broadway somewhere, and she was with him in the car, and their young son was in a bassinet on the back seat. So, and he's arrested, and he goes away for about 9 or 10 years after that. But still, she decides to go and front up at the coroner's inquest and tell her story. And she starts telling the story, and she literally evaporated, which is curious. At the coroner's court, she didn't leave. In those days, the coroner's court was in Glebe opposite Sydney University. There was the front doors, but there was also a rear entrance in that little dark laneway, Spark Street from memory, which is not only where the bodies would come in through the door and go out the door, but also where the coppers would enter and a lot of court staff would go in. It was quite discreet, as opposed to the full glare of Parramatta Road. The story I heard, she actually departed that after she'd given some pretty explosive evidence, and she was coming back for a bigger one the next day. She's taken out the back door and disappears. The story that seems to have currency in it, works for me unfortunately, is that one of the coppers who may have been assisting her, she gets in the car is Roger and Nettie Smith, taken allegedly out to the Alexandria Park where the old brick kilns are, somewhere out there, which in those days was a dump, murdered and just dumped, and never seen or heard from again. I spoke to her brother a couple of years ago too, as a journalist.
And just one thing on that, I mean, later there was, Nettie Smith started talking to NCA, and he said that Rogerson killed her. And then there was an inquest into her in 2000, 2001. But I don't know if you've heard this, that
I have.
The coronial papers went missing.
It's one of those really intriguing Sydney stories that everything about her has disappeared.
Yeah.
It's a bit like some crime. Nettie Smith's crime books and Rogerson books were usually stolen from libraries, by the way. It's just one of those odd things. And the coroners, they don't even have a fragment. And that's weird, because I've got some old stuff out of the coroners before. You know, they put together a bit of a file, but Lynn just disappeared. And I find that quite disturbing.
And they did see Roger one time in the coroner's office around that time. Some lawyer said that he saw him going through files. So I don't know if that's true or that's a rumour.
No, but it's the sort of thing Roger would do, I would imagine. He was quite thorough in clearing up after himself. He just wasn't very useful with CCTV.
So she's wiped, sorry, Michael. She's been wiped really from knowledge.
Absolutely, it's a great sadness.
It's a very sad story. We might just speak for another few minutes and then open it up to questions if any of you have them. But John, can you tell us what happened to Sallie-Anne after that, and in particular, of course, when and how she died?
Well, she died in 1986, February the 6th. She got a phone call at home at her apartment, and for a drug deal. She was back on the drugs. She'd done a lot of things in between 81 when Lanfranchi was killed and 86 when she was killed. I mean, she wrote, became a journalist. She got a huge advance from Penguin Books to write a biography, all sorts of things she did. But then gradually she slipped back into the drug world. She was going to meet her dealer in Centennial Park around 11 o'clock. Her dealer was a guy called Warren Richards, who's still out there. I did see him out to the front of the building earlier, and he was Nettie Smith's right-hand man and her dealer. And she went to meet Warren. She met him at Centennial Park, parked outside the gates, went inside, and next morning she was found strangled in Busby's Pond. Police didn't interview Warren Richards until a year later. Took them that long to interview him. They didn't interview Smith, and I think they had a very cursory interview of Rogerson, like, where were you, Roger? I was out at
the Merrylands Bowling Club. Have you been there before, Roger? Oh, first time.
Yeah. Did you sign in, Roger? No, I didn't. So anyway, that's what happened. And then some years later, Nettie Smith confessed to killing her in Long Bay to a prison mate. And he went to trial, he went to committal, he was found, sent to trial, and at trial for some odd reason, I can tell you if you've got half an hour why, he was found not guilty of murdering her.
This is probably my last question, but what danger did she pose by that point, given everything she'd already said?
Well, according to what I know is that she was continuing to bring it up. She was writing for Penthouse. She had this biography. She was bringing the matter up and bagging him, to the world, I suppose. It was 86 he got kicked out too.
Yeah, it was. Roger was having a bad couple of years, fortunately. Lanfranchi's shooting took the lustre off the golden boy of the CIB, and his career was just going downhill. Then, of course, he shoots Mick Drury, one of his fellow coppers, and that's unsuccessful, fortunately for Mick. He then goes to trial for that. There are other allegations drifting around. He became almost a full-time defendant. And so by 86, and he's also seething with hate. And I think Henry quite rightly knew that Sallie-Anne Huckstepp and her advocacy on television particularly was the cause of his demise. So he went from the golden boy to pretty much in deep strife, and it was 86 he left. So not unlike Christopher Flannery, who disappeared the year beforehand, it was getting rid of someone who was troublesome. Getting someone who's impeding
and
my
she
career.
was dating a federal policeman too, which they would have been worried about that. And I think he was still bringing in heroin at that stage, wasn't he? Around 86, working with Billy Duff.
Yeah, he just didn't stop. The curiosity is that, and it's a small story, I think I've written about it, so we're on reasonably stable ground. The morning that Sallie-Anne died, Nettie has Smith has run into the Iron Duke Hotel, where the publican who's doing what publicans do, he's just standing outside with a hose, watering the whatever. The publican is a former homicide squad detective. He told me, and I think he's spot on the money, Nettie runs in, he's very distressed, very sweaty, and he's got scratches all over his face. And he says something along the lines of, "Mate, you're an ex-detective. What do you do if you shove someone in the water and they drown?" And the detective says, "Well, mate, they'll bob back up quickly unless you stab them a few times." Oh shit, we didn't do that. And Nettie bolts out again, and minutes later the ABC announced that the body's been found in Busby's Pond. It's a compelling story, and it just sort of tends to sit comfortably with me.
Yeah, I interviewed Billy Duff. He said the same story to me.
All right, look, thanks very much to both of you. I might ask you, the audience, if you have any questions, and anyone on Zoom, if you want to use chat to send some through now, you'd be most welcome. But anyone here got an audience for our panellists? Please. Sorry, I think just because of Zoom and everything, it might be best if you stand up. You can take your mask off and tell us the question. I might actually repeat it. We're not using microphones for the audience just because of COVID. So, yeah.
I was just wondering, what was the testimony
I believe it was more...
I just got to ask the question, sorry, just for the people watching on Zoom. So the question is, do we know what Lynne Woodward might have been going to say that caused her to be disappeared?
From what I know, and the family have the transcript of her first day, but that was she didn't go into she was going to go into more detail of actually what Rogerson did and how Lanfranchi was murdered, and basically backing up Sallie-Anne's story, but more detail. I think she gave evidence very late on that first day.
Yeah, I think it was late afternoon. She's called. Yeah.
She's called back to finish her, because they always finish pretty early at the coroner. So that's the reason.
I've seen the statement that she gave to her, or to a solicitor before the inquest, and she talks in some detail about Rogerson selling heroin and other police too. And she also says that when she got arrested sometimes, if the police wanted her to do something she didn't want to do, like tell a story to support something they were pushing, they would actually offer her heroin when they arrested her, like at the time, in that moment, just to try and encourage her to do what they wanted. So she had a lot to say.
Yeah, and sadly we'll never know precisely what she was going to say that day.
Yeah, please, question down the back.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what did you think of the account in the media case of the lawyer who was in jail with Eddie Trigg? Do you think that was a credible account? And I think is it Killing Juanita book, this is the second question. I think he says towards the end of the book that she was murdered downstairs and there was Eddie Trigg there, and one other person was in the club, was in that room, and eventually it would sort of come out who that other person was. Does that make sense? Sorry.
Yeah, I might just repeat the question. Just tell me if I get it right. The first question was, I think in the recent ABC coverage, someone said they were at Long Bay Jail and they heard certain information. They were working undercover for the police or something.
Yep.
What do you think of that? And then the second question was, there's an unidentified person who was at the Carousel Club that day, possibly. Does John think that might ever come out?
With the first question about the ABC show, there's a good article if you want to go to Google it by Neil Mercer, who used to be a journalist, probably still is. He refutes all that he was at the inquest into Anita and said that that guy who was in jail, whose name I believe is Innes, didn't give that information and wasn't working for the detective who's called Arkins. So that was all made up. Peter Rees agrees that was made up, that part of the documentary.
Don't you think if he was undercover, there was a good reason why he wouldn't give an account if we worked forward?
He was undercover then, you're saying? Yeah, but he said he was working with the detective who's in charge of the case, Carl Arkins, who said he wasn't. And then he gave evidence at the inquest, and what he said to the ABC wasn't what he said at the inquest. So read the article by Neil Mercer. You can Google it on, it's really good. It just goes through saying that Juanita deserved more than this, that they shouldn't have called him in. But as to your second question, that guy was Shane Martin Simmons, who he was also there. And I think there was two other people there in the club. Well, Marilyn King, who was the boyfriend of Eddie Trigg, and another guy who was the public relations officer. But Shane Martin Simmons was also found guilty with Eddie Trigg. I don't know if you can add anything to that.
Yeah, just a couple of quick things. So also have a look at the Media Watch. Did a fantastic outing on the ABC's documentary, and they drew up what a few of us had also drawn up a little bit beforehand, was that if you go into Trove, one of the great assets I think we have as a writer particularly, you go into Trove and you'll actually see that the gentleman who popped up as giving evidence, a couple of things. One, Trove actually places him in jail well beforehand for, I think from memory, fraud offences of which he was later convicted, and a few other bits and pieces, so he was sort of there at the time. On the flip side, when I heard the allegation, my first thought was, this is a load of rot. It makes no practical sense. And if someone, and we get as a crime writer, people knock on your door, they ring you up regularly, they've always got these great fanciful stories. What happens is that I think it's incumbent upon a journalist to actually make sure that story has some credit. If this gentleman knocked on my door and said, blah, 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 Carl Arkins, the detective, has got me in jail to do this undercover, my first thought would have been possibly unprintable in Polite, because I just don't believe it. It doesn't make sense. Walk it through, it makes even less sense. as for the Juanita stuff, there's so many stories about Juanita, and you get those regularly as well. The most recent one I got was about 3 weeks ago, where I'm told an old gentleman in the Cross actually has the mysterious Eddie Trigg diary, which no one's seen, and it also includes a map with an X. Now, this is all fabulous, and you never say no, because just in case someone does have the map with the X, but so far the gentleman hasn't come forward. But oddly enough, and this is this weird business we're in, a woman contacted me via Facebook. She said, and this is an absolutely genuine human being, she lived across the road from Eddie Trigg's mother. And she didn't embellish the story, she didn't try and sell it, she just said, I think you should know, coppers weren't interested. The morning after Juanita disappeared, Eddie Trigg and 2 of his mates, all well dressed, turned up in a rented Hertz van, she said, and she just glimpsed out the window and she saw in the back of the van what appeared to be a fishing net with something in it. And she said, and she was quite genuine, she said, I can't see it, I had no idea what it was, I just thought you should know. So I drove out, stood where she was standing in her kitchen, in front of her kitchen window, looked across the road, and I could see quite clearly what she was talking about. So you get these people that embellish a lot, or they come up with stories to write themselves into it. Then you get the genuine ones who just tell you what they saw, just the facts.
Gosh. Another question, please? Yeah, please.
Hello. Thank you very much for your session. I wanted to know whether you think the Sydney police were outliers in a global or even an Australian context, and if they are, whether there's an explanation for that.
Okay, so a very interesting question, which I suppose, to summarise it, is were the Sydney police worse than other police forces, and if so, why? John, do you want to start on that?
I think they were. I mean, a couple of police or lawyers have said that was the most corrupt police force in the English-speaking world. But I think Queensland Police would have given it a run for its money. I mean, you read the Fitzgerald inquiry. I mean, they were just as bad. And, I mean, that's what our first person we talked about, Shirley Briffman, exposed what was happening there. And at least their police commissioner went to jail for 10 years. That was Lewis. While here, no one really high up it was ever went to jail. Did you know what's the highest? Bill Allen probably was the only one back in the.
Yeah, and that was stupidity. I think.
But all those commissioners,
yeah,
none of those commissioners.
Everyone got away. Everyone got away with what they were alleged to have done, and some of them were just corrupt. Some of them were just dumb. It's a curious question. And one of the reasons I think New South Wales was so successful, because just to build to it, is there are a lot of people who made sure they were successful because everyone was profiting from it, which included a rather large number of Sydney-based lawyers, possibly some of the judiciary and possibly some of the government as well at the time. I remember just quickly as a kid, a mate of mine got into some terrible strife. We went to see the Sydney's possibly most famous criminal lawyer, who's long dead, fortunately, who was also one of the, I think he was president of the ethics group of the Law Society, wandered in, sat down with him, and the guy said, 10 grand, I can make it go away. And that was the starting point. So that's how business was done in this city. Everyone was in on the giggle, and that's, I think, what made New South Wales so successful at being corrupt. Yeah. Mind you, we've been at it since 1788, I suspect.
We're almost out of time. I'll just ask one more question. Sorry, that's come up from Zoom, which is, what about today? If someone like Sallie-Anne Huckstepp was in that situation today, which is probably less likely, hopefully. First question, who should they approach? And secondly, do we still need stronger laws to protect people like her who want to, blow the whistle? Very quick answer from both of you, maybe, John?
I don't think it would happen today to that extent. I think there's so many extra bodies, crime. There's so much scrutiny now that there wasn't then. And I don't think you could have a Rogerson today, but do you?
No, I think the Rogersons are dinosaurs. I think they became dinosaurs, fortunately, when, in part, substantially because of Sallie-Anne's work.
Yeah.
The 80s was a sea change. The media finally got up with the game as well, and they started asking questions they probably should have asked a lot before. So, yeah, I don't think a repeat's likely.
Yeah, and if you look at the headlines from that period, they're all the criminals are all bad, they're prostitutes. I mean, they used to call Sallie-Anne Huckstepp, always had Sallie-Anne Huckstepp, prostitute and heroin addict, in the description so that you would never believe her. And that was the media, really.
And that's changed so dramatically these days, and thank goodness for that.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank our guests for that fascinating lesson in horrible history. And just to say that the session's almost over, and we'll ask them to go out to the bookshop fairly quickly. If you want to have a chat to them, you're welcome, but would you mind going over there with us to talk to them? And of course, you're welcome to buy their books, which they're happy to sign for you, so you can't return them. Can you please join me in thanking our two guests?